So I think what I sort of started with over the last few years, I've got increasingly interested in reading. And I've come to realize that over the course of my career, as I've been teaching people to read at university, one of the problems that I've faced is that I've forgotten what it's like to learn to read. I've realized that through, as my daughter is learning to read at the moment, seeing her like as a 5-year-old trying to do it, but also as our students are transitioning to come to university, that we're trying to teach them to read in specific ways, and I've forgotten how I learned to do that, which creates a real barrier, I think, to getting them to read how we want. So today I'm going to share some of what I've learnt about what it was like to go to school in antiquity, in late antiquity, the end of the ancient world, and a little bit about what it's like to try and read online now if you're a student. I wouldn't say that there's an argument in this paper. It's just some stuff that I think is interesting in a sort of structure. And I think that's the sort of privilege of giving an inaugural. You can do what you want within reason. So I'm going to come back to these two images. One is of a Christian saint being scourged for reading classical literature on that side, and some hedgehogs as we move through the talk. As I was preparing the talk, I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll look back at like when I started teaching, which is now about 20 years ago. Started teaching at university about 20 years ago on a course called The Rise of Christianity at the University of Manchester. And I remember how we taught that. It was led by someone called Kate Cooper, who's now a professor at Royal Holloway in London. And really the way in which we did it was read one page of text every week. We pored over this with these first-year students, trying to teach them how to engage with this in a very detailed way with the text. I also remembered how terrifying it was to be in front of just 10, 15, if they all turned up, maybe 20 undergraduate students, how like scary that actually was at the time, and how really crap I was at it to begin with, and how it took me a long time to kind of figure out how to kind of improve, get a bit better. And as I reflected, I thought, well, actually my pedagogy hasn't really developed that much since then. Really what I still do is read small blocks of text together with students. Sometimes it's online, sometimes it's in person, and then try to come to some sort of understanding of it together. So in the spirit of that reading things together, there's quite a lot of text on some of the slides. I'm not expecting you to read it, but you can read it if you drift off and get bored of listening to me. And there are some bits of those texts that I really want to try and focus on. The other thing I've just mentioned before, that my daughter is learning to read at the moment, and my favourite book over the last couple of years has been this book, The Knight Who Wouldn't Fight. It's a story about a knight called Leo who really loves reading, but his parents really want him to love fighting. So they buy him a new shield and sword and send him off on a quest to defeat a dragon. And on the journey to defeat the dragon, he doesn't defeat the other monsters that he meets, the troll, the griffin, and the dragon eventually. He doesn't defeat them by fighting them. He defeats them by reading them stories. Defeats them by... It's a book about the power of reading, and for me that's quite powerful, and I think it speaks to anyone who stayed at university to do humanities. It's about that tension. It's about staying at uni and doing reading rather than going to the real world, which is what I've endeavoured to do for the last 30 years nearly now, I guess. I'm going to do a bit of context to lay out what education was like at the end of the Roman world and the start of the Middle Ages. I'm going to introduce a couple of the figures that I'm going to talk about, a man called Libanius and a man called Augustine. And then at the end, I'm going to get to my old friend Isidore, who I did my PhD on many years ago. Interspersed with that, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work I've done on digital reading. And I'm going to really, I think if I have an argument, it's about the power of reading together. Something that we can do, obviously, in person, physically in the same space, or something we can do digitally. Just the only map of the presentation, the three people that I'm going to talk about in a bit of detail. In my abstract, I talked about introducing you to some little-known teachers. I think apart from possibly one or two people in the room, nobody will have heard of this guy called Libanius, who is a teacher of rhetoric, somebody who teaches how to give speeches in the city of Antioch in the Eastern Roman Empire at the end of the 4th century. His contemporary, Augustine, Saint Augustine, who many people will have heard of and may have gone to a school named after, for example, is his rough contemporary. And I'm going to talk about him as somebody who gives a story about his life, his career really, that develops through this process of reading in lots of different ways. And then I'm going to end by talking about Isidore, who's a bishop in the south of what's now Spain in the early 7th century. So 2 people from the late 4th century, 1 guy from the early 7th century. So who is Libanius? So as I said, he's from Antioch. He's from quite an elite background. He's somebody who goes to be educated in the city of Athens, becomes a teacher in Constantinople, and then goes back to his hometown of Antioch, where he becomes a teacher of rhetoric, as I said. He's really quite well connected, and he's such a kind of prominent figure within Antiochian society that he's entrusted with delivering speeches. For example, when an emperor comes to the city, a speech of welcome would be given, and Libanius was entrusted with that on a number of occasions. Why he's interesting to think about in terms of education is that lots of his works survive. So over 60 of his speeches survive, many of which talk about his approach to teaching. Over 1,500 of his letters survive, again, many of which are about his students, written to the parents of the students to tell them how the kids are doing, trying to get jobs for his students, sucking up to his ex-students to try and make connections. So when I've been using him to teach, I've used him as a means of giving a kind of really textured view of what a classroom might have been like, what a school might have been like, what it was like to teach and learn in late antiquity. He's a fascinating figure. And he's a pagan, so we need to bear that in mind, because this is the period in which Christianity is emerging to the fore. During the lifetime of Augustine, Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. It's also the period in which all these groups of people that we used to call barbarians, but now we don't generally call barbarians, but it's much easier to call them barbarians, so I'm going to do that. Lots of different people like the Visigoths, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons are all moving into what used to be the Western Roman Empire, and we used to think that they all smashed it up, but now we think that they just kind of fiddled around with it a little bit and much of it stayed the same. Anyway, that's not really important, but we're in this kind of transitional moment. Christianity's emerging as the powerful force. We've got these new barbarian kingdoms emerging. And here we get St. Jerome, the dream of St. Jerome. In a letter to a young woman called Eustochium, Jerome reports having a dream, a fever dream really, in which he's dragged before Christ here, in a tribunal, so Christ's acting as a judge, and Christ asks, "Who are you?" And Jerome says, "I'm a Christian." And Christ says, "No, you're not a Christian, you're a Ciceronian," which means he's accusing him of being much more wedded to classical literature, to the literature of the classical past, to Cicero, the kind of emblematic Latin writer. You like him much more than you like Christianity. And he then has Jerome scourged until he promises, I'll never touch that stuff again. I'll never have anything to do with this again. Instead, I will be a pure Christian. So it's obviously a highly kind of crafted story about kind of conversion through reading. It's a story about what books we accept, what texts do we accept, and what texts don't we accept. We don't like that pagan stuff anymore. Don't like that Roman stuff. This gets us to Augustine, who's somebody who also had a problem, a bit of a habit with the classics. He's a North African. He's born in a small city from a middling level family, and manages to, through his education, to move through the Roman educational system and kind of make good. He's somebody who's in a sort of undecided camp religiously. He ends up being a Christian, obviously ends up being a saint, but through his life, in a book that he wrote after he'd become a bishop called The Confessions, he tells a story of his kind of gradual conversion to Christianity. And this story is one very much of reading as being part of the process of becoming a true Christian. So he's just this sort of spiritual autobiography. And this text really resonates with people of the time. It very rapidly becomes a bestseller when everything's being copied by hand. But people are reading it very soon afterwards, and it's extremely popular. And the second course I ever taught at Manchester with someone called Conrad Leiser, who's now works at Oxford University, was essentially a close reading of the Confessions. There were 12 weeks of the course, and happily there are 12 books of the Confessions. So we simply read a book a week, stopping actually at book 10, because in book 11 and 12 it goes a bit crazy, and that was just a bit difficult. So that gave us enough time to kind of fit everything in. And that really taught me again about the value of kind of close reading. The value of reading with somebody who knows a text really well and can guide you through it was, it was amazing. And also that can engage you with something that's ostensibly really, really esoteric, this kind of spiritual autobiography. Okay, so that's given you Augustine and Libanius. I'm now going to do a little bit of introduction to Roman education. So Roman education is Romans don't really value, business studies isn't that important or important at all. Technical disciplines aren't where it's at. It's not about the cutting edge of lab-based subjects. Romans are all about language at the elite level of education. You can see this in the sort of school exercises that survive from antiquity in thousands and thousands of papyrus fragments, for example. And we can see it in narrative sources as well, sources where people talk about education. Here we've got an extract from a 2nd century biography of sort of 5th century BC Greek figure, in which this biography is saying, this guy called Alcibiades, who's a Greek general and statesman from Athens, is giving an account of his childhood. He says he visited a teacher and asked for a book of Homer. So Homer, the kind of foundational book of Greek literature, or maybe of all literature. He said he didn't have any Homer, so Alcibiades punched him and left. But when another teacher said that he had a copy of Homer, which he had corrected himself, Alcibiades said, "Why are you bothering to teach the alphabet when you're good enough to correct Homer? Why aren't you teaching young men?" This illustrates the importance of language, the violence of the schoolroom. And I think one of the things that attracted me to this late antique education was its violent nature. I don't know if it was some kind of vicarious sort of it's really frustrating, it's not working, They had one way of resolving it, which was violently. It talks about the classics, the importance of engaging with these classic texts like Homer. And it's really elitist, isn't it? You shouldn't be bothering this piffling business of teaching people the nuts and bolts of reading. What you should be doing is engaging them with this higher order learning. So they're elitist, just like we are. And part of that was the point of education, of that higher order learning, was to train young men, elite young men, a very small group of them, to rule, to imbue them with certain characteristics, certain learning that would enable them to demonstrate that they belonged in the elite class that was running the empire. To train them in rhetoric, so to put it bluntly, so they could do what they wanted, so they could get other people to do what they wanted. It was about learning how to, once you'd mastered the grammar, the basics of language, it was about learning how to manipulate it in order to make the world as you wanted it for yourself at that very elite level. So Romans also had, just like we do, they had university towns and campuses. Places like Alexandria had these quite very large complexes that were devoted to this higher order learning. They had lecture theatres that don't look that dissimilar to the sort of lecture theatres that many of us have to teach in. That probably are warmer because they're in Alexandria than the ones that we have to teach in. and in which the AV probably worked because there wasn't any. And you can see that the way in which this is laid out from the plan, you can see the more or less standardized layout. The fact that it's next to the bath complex and the theatre, it's suggesting that there's some level of planning going on here. This is like a civic project for some of these cities like Alexandria, Athens, Bordeaux, Beirut, lots of different places. So they become a kind of source of civic pride for some cities. They also had things like tuition fees. So you see lots of, reflected in some of the sources, you see an anxiety from teachers about whether the students' parents are ever going to pay them up. Or students writing letters to their fathers asking them to send the fees so that they can pay the teacher. They have report cards that are sent, well, what are the equivalent of report cards that are sent from the teachers to the parents? This is one from Libanius to a man called Acacius. And it says that when you sent your son to us, you said that he was basically he was unruly. He'd be much better at fighting than he could ever be at learning. Libanius says to him, but I've solved that problem for you. I've taught him how to value peace much more than to value the use of his fists. There are hundreds of these letters in Libanius' collection and from other collections too. There's this strong idea that the teacher is responsible for forming these young men into an image of their father. And that the teacher is, at the same time, he's a rhetorician, he's trying to cultivate a relationship with the father, to show that he's done a good job, to generate more business for the future. So it's all about reputation as well. So I think some of this resonates with how teaching works nowadays, whether in schools or universities. Right, I'm now going to talk briefly about some of the stuff I've done in relation to digital reading as we press on. I just wanted to point out one of the things, what got me into this, why I am a Renaissance unicorn or whatever I am. It was the time between finishing my PhD and starting my postdoctoral fellowship. I spent some time, 2.5 years, working at a place called the Centre for Inquiry-Based Learning in the Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sheffield, which no longer exists. But for a brief sort of 5.5 year period, during which I was at it for some of, we were funding lots of projects and working with people to experiment with pedagogy and with technology, and to sort of like play around with how we teach the subjects that, subjects in the arts and social sciences. And that's really what got me interested in the whole, how we teach. At the same time as I had my sort of medieval and sort of late antique history and historical interests. One project that I've done recently is that I've been involved in recently with a number of partners at various universities, which you can see listed on here, was about online reading, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about over the next couple of slides, and then I'll intersperse some of that over the rest of the presentation. What we were interested in doing was finding out how we teach students to learn or to read online when they come to university, and also what practices do they adopt? How do they actually do it? And I'm pleased that one of the students who was involved in that project is actually here, Annabelle, so amazing. Thanks for coming, Annabelle, who now works in our department. So we did some surveys, we did some work with students, we did some work with colleagues to try and identify what's kind of good practice, what works, what doesn't. So here's some of the things that we found out. I'm also sort of addicted to Duolingo, which I know those of you who teach languages, I appreciate. It's not a very good way of learning languages, but it is also extremely addictive if you're into really tedious things. Anyway, so we asked, for example, one of the questions we posed to the teachers who responded to our survey was, how important is online reading to students learning in your discipline? So that online reading, how important is it? And I think we can all agree that there are a few outliers, but pretty much people think it's rather important. Yes? Is that your reading of the graph too? Good. Well, that's what I'm telling you it is anyway. But then we asked staff and students to rate how good they thought they were. Staff thought that students were sort of, if to sum it up in a sort of just sound, like meh. At sort of online reading, they're kind of okay, but more of them are not very good at it than are good at it. When we asked students, we got almost the exact reverse of that result. Students, most of them thought they're kind of okay at it, but a lot more of them thought that we're really quite good at this online reading business, and hardly any of them thought that they were rubbish at it. So you've got a kind of interesting divergence there between what the staff think and what the students think. The staff responses, in a way, when we dug into that, are in a way a little bit more interesting. There's a very strong idea amongst those that students at least struggle to understand texts and arguments, which is obviously a bit of a problem because that's what we're trying to get them to do. They often use the wrong tactics when they're trying to engage with text, so they'll adopt a surface approach to reading when it would be better to try and really dig into it, and then sometimes do the reverse. Adopt a sort of try and really dig into it, and what we want them to do is to just kind of float above it a little bit. One of the things as well is that academic respondents were really strongly of the opinion that digital distraction is what's causing all of this. That social media is rotting students' brains, and it means that they're incapable of reading long texts, long bits of writing, and that when they do embark on the process of reading a long text, they simply can't concentrate enough on it. I'm not saying that that's true or false, but that's the perspective that was put across. That's the sort of dominant sort of view around this kind of distraction that's there. And also that there's a huge amount of, students talked about this too, a huge amount of distraction in the sort of digital environment, that it's hard to put your phone down, it's hard to close the app and focus on your reading. And I think we've all experienced that to different degrees, probably. So in the third part of the lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about... no, I'm not going to talk a little bit. There's going to be a good 20 minutes in which I talk about reading lessons. I'm going to talk about how people read in late antiquity, how they were taught to read, and I'm going to make some probably quite tenuous efforts to relate that to digital reading, but I'm going to have a go. This object, which is not to scale, it is much smaller, is a small fragment of pottery, on which somebody has written in Greek several lines, copied out several lines of Homer's Iliad. And this object illustrates a number of important points. Again, the focus on these classical texts, a small canon of important texts like Homer. It focuses on the idea of repetition as being really important. It connects reading and writing, which I think is something that I often forget about. The two are interconnected, obviously. And it illustrates how Romans wrote on pretty much anything. This is the equivalent of a Roman post-it note. It's something that's lying around that you can pick up and sort of scribble on and then throw away. But they're using materials that are accessible, that you can write on as part of this kind of reading economy. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about reading more or reading less, or the quality of reading. So when I first started teaching, and I'm thinking about the first probably 5 or 6 years that I was teaching, I thought that the students didn't do the reading. And obviously some students don't do reading. I'm not naive enough to think that they all do the reading. And I think some of that frustration fueled my vicarious interest in the violence of the classroom in the late Roman period. But then over time, thinking about it, talking to some students, I figured out that probably what I think what's going on a lot of occasions is that it's not that students haven't done the reading, it's that they haven't processed the reading. It's they haven't, either by magic or because we've encouraged them to, sort of like worked through it, thought about it. They've sort of passively sailed through it and got to the end. They've endured it, survived it, and then they don't really know what it was all about, in some cases. So I developed some strategies to try and help them to engage, some of which I figured out myself, some of which I learned by talking to colleagues. So I tried to scaffold the reading, provide support for them. I definitely tried to give them less of it to make it seem less intimidating. I tried to grade their reading, so to give them marks for the reading that they'd done, figure out a way in which I could assess it. And I tried, one of the things that technology allowed me to do was to figure out ways in which I could get a perspective on what the students had read before they came to class. So to start to see the students reading more in a sort of live way, rather than something that is simply presented to me in the class where I'm like, oh, they haven't done it, or in the assessment where I'm like, the essay, they didn't get it. How can I start to see the process more? Okay, so like I said, Romans are really into literacy, and Christianity is a religion of the Roman Empire. It merges within the Roman Empire and flourishes within it. This is one of my favorite texts ever. It's an apocryphal text from the 2nd century, and it gives an account of Jesus's childhood. So it's one of those texts that doesn't make the director's cut of the Bible as we know it today. But these texts are really interesting because they reflect contemporary social values. You can see that manifested in the way they talk about not just education, but loads of other things. The text isn't written to tell us about Roman values of education, but it does tell us about those by accident almost. So my reading of this text and the longer text is that Christ is essentially like in a superhero film. It's where the early stages where you're learning to harness the power, and the power is sort of running out of control. How does the young person who's possessed of these supernatural powers learn to harness them? So it tells us about literacy. Joseph wants Jesus to be educated so that he can move on in the world. It's reflecting that idea that fathers are responsible for the literacy of their children, of their sons. It's reflecting the violence of the classroom. And that violence, I think happily, if it had to be violent, it wasn't just the teachers beating up the students. It was the students beating up the teachers as well. Everybody could have a go. So Jesus basically talks back to the teacher. He says, if you know what A and B are in Greek, alpha and beta, you tell me. I'm not going to tell you because I already know because I'm, special. The teacher gets annoyed and hits him on the head. Teacher on student violence. Christ curses the teacher falls down dead. Seemingly falls down dead, I should say, because the bit that I didn't, afterwards it's all resolved and the teacher recovers and everything's okay in the end. So, but it's this idea of sort of like the struggle to make somebody literate can involve these sort of violent processes. This also the sort of violence is also reflected in the grammatical instruction. This is a quote from a secondary author in which they're talking about the model verb that's used in the verb tables that teach people Greek. So when I was learning Latin, the model verb was amare, amo, amas, amat. I love, you love, he, she, it loves, etc. That's proposing quite a nice view of the world, isn't it? Quite a nice view of the classroom if that's what you're repeating over and over again to learn the verbs, to learn the language. In late antiquity, in this particular collection of verb tables, the model verb is to beat. The verb, the words that would have been repeated repeated over and over again, where I beat, you beat, he beats. Now, when I do this with students as an outreach activity, not beating them, telling them about this, I get them to say these words out and to think about, how the language is functioning and what sort of message that might be giving about the relationship between an individual or developing their relationship to their learning. Because the language works in the future and in the passive, doesn't it? I will be beaten. It's pretty dark. Okay. So this speaks about the violent process of education as well as its kind of content in this period. It speaks to this idea of drill and repetition being really important. And it talks about, so like volume is important. And that made me think, well, maybe my stripping back the reading, getting them to read less, wasn't such a good idea. Should I be figuring out ways of getting my students to read more? So, when we did our little survey, we asked students, how much reading do you do a week? And depending upon the audience I've spoken about this to, people are either really shocked or totally unsurprised, so I'll be interested to see which camp you fall in. The good news about this graph is that as students progress through their studies, they are reporting to us that they read more as they move on. It is still suggesting that 50% of our first-year respondents, first-year undergraduates, read less than 5 hours a week in total for their studies, which is quite shocking considering our respondents were mostly from humanities disciplines where we want them to read a lot. There's also one PhD student who's reading less than 5 hours a week, which they must have just clicked the wrong button, I think. So it's something about volume, I think. We also asked people if they had a disability that affected their ability to engage in reading, and we found that people who have disability are, as we would expect, less likely to engage in online reading compared to their peers who don't report having that disability. It's not unexpected, but it does suggest there's a sort of vicious cycle in operation that you're less likely to read, therefore you read less, which presumably is going to impact your engagement and etc. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was understanding your audience. And we speak a lot about students moving from school into university. We call it transition. And I think a lot of that focuses on what students can't do, what's wrong with students when they get to university, instead of thinking about what can they do, how can we turn that. I think it would be interesting to talk about how we could turn that into a positive. And one of the most transformative things for me, one of the most inspirational things over the last couple of years has been the amount of work that I've done with teachers. And talking to teachers about some of these issues is really, really interesting because they've given me a different perspective on students and on reading. And our teachers, the teachers that I'm talking to you about today, were very well aware of their audience. They knew that they needed to pitch what they were speaking about and what they were teaching about at an appropriate level. This is a quote from Augustine in a text in which he's talking about how do you educate somebody in the basics of Christianity? And he's saying, well, because you will have a diverse audience, what you need to do is pitch your education at different levels. You need to think that people who come from the schools of rhetoric will be much more into serious questions, he calls it. We need to encourage those people to be humble because they might have a tendency to kind of think themselves better. Whereas if you're teaching to the rudibus, the people, the bumpkins, the people who don't have very much education or any education, you need to adopt different strategies. We can see this in how he tells the story of his own education. I'm not expecting you to read that. But what he talks about is he gives a narrative in this autobiography of, I learned rhetoric, and that was intended to make me into a lawyer. Then I became a teacher of rhetoric. Then I moved Then because the students in Carthage, where I was teaching, weren't very well behaved, I moved to Rome, where I heard they were better behaved. Then I got the dream job. I got a job in Milan as the professor of rhetoric in Milan, which at that time was the imperial capital. So he's giving a story of his he's giving a story that everyone can identify with who is literate in this period. He's talking about him like living the dream. He was really good at rhetoric and he kind of moved through this system. He's also, in a way, presenting himself as an everyman kind of figure that people can identify with. He presents himself in this specific kind of way. Right, and he talks about his conversions. He doesn't just have one conversion, he has many conversions. He talks about how, I was really into Cicero, and that was when I was into rhetoric, and that was a bit rubbish. In the end, I didn't think that was very good. Then I was into philosophy, but that was, sorry to the philosophers who are here, but that was the wrong choice. I shouldn't have been into philosophy. Then I dabbled in this religion called Manichaeism, which is a kind of dualistic religion. And that was kind of interesting for a bit, but I didn't really like that after I read about it. Then I read about Christianity, and that dragged me in a bit more. Then I read about ascetic Christianity. That was what really kind of got me involved. So he unfolds this story as his career is developing, of reading being the thing that converts him, that moves him on in his life. It ends, that final conversion ends with the event that's depicted here, where he reports having been in a garden in Milan, sort of, I can only describe as kind of having a bit of a moment. Not really sort of like, struggling a little bit. And he sits there and what he says is, I heard a voice telling me, Tolle lege, pick it up and read it, pick it up and read it. He says there's this child's voice kind of that he hears when he's in the garden. It makes him pick up this book and he reads St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, and that makes him convert. That's the moment that causes his conversion. So it's very much this story of conversion through reading. So people like Augustine know how to press the buttons of the people that they're teaching in the stories that they're telling about themselves, in the stories that they're telling about reading, that they're using this as a means of kind of getting the audience on side and engaging them. So let's think back to our survey. Digital reading is really important to our students. So digital reading is really important to our students and they're not very good at it. So how much time do you spend thinking about it in your classes? Not very much. So there are some, and obviously we were asking people who maybe don't see that as their primary responsibility. We're trying to teach lots of things to our students. But there's a disjunction there when we come to think about reading online. And this is my favourite negative response to the question, which made me wonder why this person even bothered to fill in a survey that's about how we teach reading. But it's the student's responsibility. They need to do the reading. It's not up to us to understand who they are or where they come from. I'm going to propose that reading together, collaborative reading, is really important to thinking through some of these issues. And as you've seen, there's this strong tendency towards violence and the use of force to encourage people to learn in the late Roman world. My supervisor, who I won't name, my PhD supervisor, gave me an anecdote when I was starting out learning. He said that his supervisor had told him of the best way to get students on side is in the first week or two, what you really need to do is to commit one act of flagrant injustice, and then the students will never know what to expect from you and will always be sort of on edge and ready to do, they'll be at your beck and call because they won't know how to cope with this. Now, I don't think that's probably the best strategy, but at the same time as some of our authors talk about the use of force, they also talk about the importance of kind of curiosity. This is Augustine talking about how he started to learn the Greek classics. Sorry for any Greek classicists in the room. He reports having hated the Greek classics because he was forced to learn them. It wasn't like how he'd learnt Latin, which was his native language, which he'd learnt through this free curiosity. And like I told you before, he tells this story of his life unfolding through these reading episodes. When he gets to Milan, he says the pivotal moment when he got to Milan was meeting this man called Ambrose, who was bishop. And he says two more reading conversions that Ambrose effected for him. One, he says, I saw Ambrose reading silently to himself, and I was like, mind was blown, because common practice in the period was that reading would be something that you would do aloud. So he sees this kind of cutting-edge technology of reading, which is to read to yourself, and it kind of transforms the way he thinks about reading. He also says that Ambrose introduces him to ways to read the Christian scripture that make him think differently. Basically says, this is not on the slides, when I first looked at the scriptures when I was younger, they appeared to be quite unworthy to be compared to the dignity of Cicero. I was repelled by their style. What Ambrose does is teaches him how to read these texts in a deeper way. So what you can do is he teaches him how to look at the hidden meaning underneath the words, the mysteries that underlay them. And then he talks about how, in the other text, the text about how to preach to the bumpkins, some people, it's really an effective way of teaching them is to teach them these hidden meanings because it will pique their curiosity. It's most useful for these men to know that the meaning is to be regarded as superior to the word. So it's not reading the text literally, it's thinking about the meanings that are underpinning them. So I'm going to press on because I've got a few slides left and not much time. One of the things that I've been interested in is how we read together online, and I did a lot of work in a technology called Thales Elevate, which I won't bore you about in great detail, but it was a tool that enables students to read together by annotating texts online. And for me, this was transformational because it enabled me, finally, to be able to see how the students read more or less live. As they are reading, they are annotating. I can go and access that before class, and it enabled me to start to see students reading, which was, through the medium of whatever the annotation they'd added. So this was super powerful for me. We asked our students, what do you think of this in the survey that we did? And they much prefer being able to see what other people have written online. That's a really good thing. But we're a bit less keen on sharing what we think. So there's a certain kind of anxiety around sharing what you think. But students report this as being like a really powerful driver for learning in many cases. Right. So the final part of the lecture was inspired by my wife, who said, are you going to talk about ChatGPT a few days ago? And I was like, oh crap, I've forgotten to talk about ChatGPT. So the final few minutes are going to be about AI. I think one of the things about AI and reading is that we really focus a lot, if we've thought about it, about how things like ChatGPT generate text. They automate the process of writing. You can, when you put something into ChatGPT, you can see it writing really quickly. What we don't think about so much is that it automates, in the process of doing that, it automates the process of reading as well. So I asked an AI tool called Runway to generate I asked it to generate an image, but it generated a video, so I'm just going to show you a quick video. A video that ask AI to represent the relationship between AI and reading. It's pretty rubbish, isn't it? It's quite a literal depiction of machine reading. But it did the job. It's doing it again. So one of the things I wanted to say is that the anxiety around ChatGPT and AI is real, but we also need to I think if we can put some of these things in a bit of longer term perspective, we will see that these are some challenges that we faced over time. people have developed tools to meet the challenges of dealing with information overload in lots of different contexts. So in late antiquity, we see a technological transition from the dominant form of text medium being the scroll, the papyrus scroll, to it being the codex, the book, as we understand it now. We see a huge kind of shift in that period of time. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to explain very much about that, but that is connected to shifts, the bigger shifts that we see politically and religiously. Access to papyrus, which only grows in Egypt, is more restricted because of the fragmentation of the empire. So people have to figure out new ways of making text mediums, things you can write on. And parchment, the material that we start to use in the West, which is made of animal skin, does not lend itself to being rolled up like papyrus does. Isidore, my PhD guy, is somebody who's sort of like dealing with some of these issues. He used to be seen as a bit of an idiot, a dark age, sort of like a dark age figure, somebody who's desperately trying to save some of the learning of antiquity, but not really knowing what he's doing. You can see this is one of his friends, Braulio, who's writing about what Isidore did. His main text that he writes is something called the Etymologies, and this becomes a foundational text in the early Middle Ages and through the medieval period for people's understanding of language. So let's have a look. So one of the things he's doing is trying to process all of this learning that's available to him, tons of stuff. So in his Etymologies, this is a list of all of the different sources of the etymologies, a vast list of classical and early Christian learning, and he's trying to condense that. The method that he uses, he organizes it thematically into a series of books, which are intended to kind of have comprehensively record knowledge. It's not a dictionary, it's more of an encyclopedia. It starts with traditional Roman education, grammar and rhetoric, sprinkles in a bit of Christian stuff, and then has a bunch of things that I think would consider, to be, he's attempting to kind of generate this kind of comprehensive encyclopedia focused on the origin of words. So let's have a look at, and his, what used to be seen as his sort of like useless compendium of useless knowledge, randomly compiled in this sort of encyclopedia, contributes to him being known as the patron saint of the internet, the source of all useless information. So what's he trying to do in the Etymologies? How do you find out what he's trying to do? Let's look at his definition of etymologies. What he says is, etymology is useful because it allows you to trace the origin of a word. And if you know the origin of a word, you know what it really means, its kind of core meaning. It allows you to get right back to basics. So it's an attempt to kind of encapsulate knowledge by this kind of tracing of origins. It's not a dictionary, but unlike Dr. Johnson in Blackadder, as depicted by Robbie Coltrane, Isidore doesn't leave out sausage, which gives an indication of some of his working practices. So, Lucanica, a kind of sausage, is so called because it was first made in Lucania. So, in this case, it's very simple. It's because it has a geographical origin. He's really into these kind of word plays. If it sounds like it, it probably is. That's where it comes from. He says, specific type of sausage is meat cut into small bits because intestines are stuffed with it. So he's making a link between the noun, farsimen, and the verb, facere. That is filled with other things mixed in. If you were to read the text, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these sorts of etymologies. He's trying to kind of comprehensively encapsulate knowledge. This and the kind of codex format mean that he and the people who follow him have to figure out ways of organizing knowledge. One of these is to excerpt bits of Isidore and use it to help you understand other texts. So to reuse it, you might illustrate it like drawing a diagram of a hedgehog. Because according to Isidore, hedgehogs feed their young by visiting vines, plucking the grapes from the vines, and as you can see there, sticking them on their spikes, and then going and enabling the young to eat the grapes off the spines. A sort of cocktail sausage delivery mechanism for antiquity. And there were more practical means in which you might have engagement. You might do things like develop tables of contents. You might develop visual methods for representing some of the text that Isidore had generated. So different ways of navigating this information. When I first started teaching, we used to have this approach to new technologies. You'd see that a lot on lecture slides and handouts. Don't use Wikipedia, it is like the worst thing you could possibly do. And over time, what we've started to do is think about, well, maybe there are productive ways in which we can start to engage students more productively with this. I realise that Wikipedia isn't a direct analogy for ChatGPT, but the process by which we're thinking about it at university and in school, I think is really productive. We're thinking about how can we engage students with it and teach them about it, rather than try to scare them off it, because it failed dismally with Wikipedia. So maybe a more productive engagement would be possible with AI. And here is where my favourite tools that allow you to see the process in operation, how you can see students reading, might be a way forward in thinking about this, rather than thinking about the product that students have produced, which they can do by writing some prompts in ChatGPT or whatever. Maybe we experiment with approaches that allow you to address the process, like the reading, for instance. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you very briefly. Amy mentioned my next project, which kind of wraps together some of this stuff, because the bit of my research that I haven't really talked about is the social history of the church in late antiquity, which is something that I've been working on for a long time. And my next project, or the project that I'm sort of starting out now, is to think about the role of unfree people and people who often aren't even named in our sources, and think about their role in the making of the church. So what you've got here is a quote, a letter from Isidore to Braulio, in which he talks about losing a previous letter that he'd been sent. You know, what I would have thought about before embarking on this project is the two big men, Braulio and Isidore. But in the letter, what you can see, he's talking about a royal servant boy, a chamber servant, who are involved in the transmission of this text and also the loss of this text. Servant is just a euphemism. It means an enslaved person. So I'm interested in exploring the roles of these sorts of people in knowledge production, in this case, in the interaction between Isidore and Braulio. And the inscription there is a recording, records the building of some churches in the south of Spain in about the year 600. And what it talks about is, you know, there's this illustrious man who pays for the building of the churches. What people haven't looked at so much is that it also mentions the role of his enslaved workers who did the work to build the churches. So what I'm going to be working on over the next few years, well, hopefully it'll be quicker than that, year or two, is the role of these kind of enslaved people in the sorts of processes that I've been talking about, the people who are kind of doing the actual work, who are doing the work that enables this knowledge production, this education system to happen. That is the end of my talk, and sorry I overran a little bit, but